The first sound I heard wasn't the water rushing, it was the screaming. I stood there on the ridge by the dam, my hand still on the lever, the steel groaning as the old floodgates yawned open wider than they had in decades. Below me, the mirror-perfect lake that had once reflected million-dollar homes was twisting, churning, collapsing. I could see them on the other side, their string-light patios, their champagne glasses, their smug faces frozen in panic as the shoreline began to vanish under rising water. The very same people who clapped when HOA President Miriam Lowe called me an old man clinging to the past. The same woman who tore down the dock I built with my own hands, the dock where my son learned to fish, where my late wife and I used to watch the sunset. They thought they broke me, but right now, they were watching their $15 million mansions sink into the mud. The air smelled like wet earth and diesel, the roar of the flood echoing through the valley. I should have felt guilty, maybe even afraid, but all I felt was a calm, steady satisfaction. For weeks, Miriam had thrown fines at me, humiliated me in meetings, laughed as her excavator tore apart 20 years of memories. She thought she owned this lake, thought her board and her rules gave her absolute power. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my family still owned this dam, and tonight it answered to me. As the water surged forward, carrying broken fences, lawn chairs, and everything else in its path, I leaned against the iron railing and let out a slow breath. Miriam's voice echoed faintly across the water, shrill and furious, but it was drowned beneath the sound of rushing current. For the first time in months, I felt free. And trust me, this was only the beginning. If you want to hear how one HOA Karen's arrogance turned into a war that sank her entire empire, stick around for the full story. And hey, if you love watching entitled people finally get what's coming to them, make sure to subscribe to my channel right now. You won't want to miss the next battle. You ever have one of those moments where the world feels normal right up until the instant it isn't? That was me the day I pulled my truck down the gravel road leading to my house by Clearwater Lake. I'd made that turn thousands of times over the last 20 years. Usually, I'd roll the window down, let the pine-scented air in, maybe catch the faint laughter of kids playing by the shoreline. It was routine, safe, mine. But that day, the moment my tires crunched over the gravel and I got my first glimpse of the water, my gut dropped like I'd just driven off a cliff. My dock was gone. Not weathered, not damaged, not in need of repair. Gone. All that remained were jagged, splintered beams jutting out of the mud like broken ribs. Planks floated aimlessly along the shoreline, the smell of diesel oil clinging to the air. And there, sitting smug as a conquering general on top of an excavator, was the president of our HOA, Miriam Lowe. Miriam wasn't just president, she was self-crowned royalty, oversized sunglasses perched on her nose, lips curled in a half-smile. She didn't even bother to climb down to speak to me face to face. She just looked down from that machine as if she were delivering a decree to a peasant and said, "Your dock was a violation. We did you a favor by removing it." A favor. That single word landed like a slap. For 20 years, that dock had been more than a pile of lumber. It was where my son had learned to tie fishing knots, tongue sticking out as he fumbled with the line while I guided him. It was where my late wife and I had sat with our feet dangling in the water, glasses of wine in hand, watching sunsets that painted the lake orange and gold. It was the backdrop to barbecues, to neighbors gathering, to kids leaping into the lake with carefree laughter. That dock was the heart of my home. Miriam called it non-compliant. To me, it was my life nigh, led together, steady as a heartbeat. I stood there on the shoreline, fists clenched so tight I thought my nails might cut into my palms. Every part of me wanted to climb up that excavator, drag Miriam down by her perfect blazer, and demand to know who gave her the right to erase my memories with the pull of a lever. But she didn't even give me the dignity of a real confrontation. She revved the machine, turned away, and dismissed me with silence. That night, I sat at my kitchen table staring at an old shoebox of photographs. My boy, still small, proud as can be when he finally tied his first knot. My wife, hand resting on mine, glowing in the fading light. Every photo had that dock in the background. It was always there, anchoring us, holding time in place. Miriam thought she'd torn down some wood. What she'd really done was take a swing at my family's history. At first, my instinct was to rebuild, grab a hammer, buy some lumber, and start again. But the letters started arriving before I could even drive to the hardware store. Envelopes with the HOA seal slapped across them like a warning. Fines, $500 a day until I restored the shoreline to community standards. Threats of legal action. Then came the public humiliation. At a neighborhood meeting, Miriam stood tall, voice carrying, and announced, "This community cannot be held back by one old man clinging to the past." People laughed, laughed. Folks who'd once eaten burgers and drank beers on that very dock actually clapped for her. That was the moment the humiliation turned into something else, something hotter, something sharper. Walking home that night, jaw locked, I stared out across the water and made myself a promise. They thought I had no power, no voice, no leverage. But they were wrong, because tucked away in my family's records was something Miriam and her smug board had long forgotten: the dam. At the north end of Clearwater Lake, hidden deep in the woods, my grandfather had built a dam when the lake was just a reservoir project. Everyone assumed the town had taken it over decades ago. But on paper, legally, the Harris family, my family, still controlled it, which meant those iron floodgates didn't answer to Miriam. They didn't answer to the HOA. They answered to me. When my neighbor Sam reminded me of that fact in a quiet, almost conspiratorial voice, it was like a spark catching dry tinder inside my chest. He leaned close and said, "You know those houses they built too close to the shore? They're sitting right in the flood zone. Everyone knew it. Money was too good to resist. But that dam still belongs to you." For the first time since Miriam leveled my dock, I felt it, a current of power running back into my veins. They thought they'd broken me, but they had no idea. The very next morning, before the sun even began to smear its first streaks of light across the lake, I was up and moving. I packed my grandfather's old toolbox, rusted latches, leather handle worn smooth from decades of calloused hands, and headed into the woods. Most of the neighbors probably thought I was sulking, licking my wounds, maybe even contemplating putting my house up for sale to escape the HOA's iron grip. Let them think it. The truth was, I was on my way to the one place Miriam couldn't touch: the dam. The dam was a relic, hidden behind a curtain of pine and oak, moss clinging to its stone base, iron gates streaked with orange rust. I hadn't stood before it in years. The last time had been with my father, when I was a boy, watching him crank the gears while he told me how his father, my grandfather, had built it to turn a shallow reservoir into a lake worth living by. Back then, I thought it was just a family story. Now, it felt like a weapon lying dormant, waiting for me to remember. Yet, the gates groaned when I tested them, stiff as old bones. The gears refused to budge at first, grinding and shrieking when I forced the lever, but I wasn't in a hurry. Each morning, I returned with oil, wire brushes, replacement bolts, and a stubborn streak that refused to die. I worked until my hands ached and my back screamed. By the third day, the first gate shifted a few inches. By the fifth, both moved enough to let a trickle of water slip through. By the end of the week, those gates responded to my hand like they'd been waiting for me all along. While I sweated in the woods, Miriam was busy playing Queen of the Shoreline. Flyers went out announcing her latest HOA gala, a celebration of growth and community. White tents popped up along the lakefront, fairy lights strung between them like a wedding reception, caterers unloading crates of champagne. She wanted the whole town to see how much wealth she'd brought to Clearwater shores. Property values had soared under her reign, and she wasn't about to let anyone forget it. I stood in the shadows that Friday night, just beyond the glow of the lanterns, watching. Couples in tailored clothes laughed over crystal glasses. Music floated across the water. Miriam stood center stage in a tailored blazer, hair perfect, posture tall, eyes shining like a politician working the campaign trail. She raised her glass and declared, "Our homes are now worth millions. This community has never been stronger." The crowd roared, glasses clinked, cheers echoed across the lake. And all the while, not one of them realized that their million-dollar homes were perched on ground that my grandfather had deliberately marked as floodplain. They'd built too close to the water, betting on greed, and now they were standing on borrowed time. I didn't move from the shadows. I didn't shout. I didn't make threats. Instead, I curled my fists until my palms burned, stared out across the black water, and felt something inside me harden. Miriam thought she had erased me when she demolished my dock. She thought she'd humiliated me when she paraded me as an example, but all she had really done was wake something up. That night, when the party dwindled and the music faded, I walked back to the dam with a flashlight bouncing in my grip. The water behind the gates shimmered in the beam, restless and heavy, pressing against the iron like a caged beast. I ran my hand over the crank, felt the smooth movement of the gears I'd restored. It wasn't time yet, but soon, very soon. The weekend passed with an odd calm, the kind that comes right before a storm. From my porch, I watched neighbors stroll along the shoreline, their heads held high like they were living in some gated paradise. The irony wasn't lost on me. Those million-dollar homes were balanced on land that could be swallowed with a single turn of a crank, and yet none of them had a clue. The HOA doubled down after the party. Monday morning, another letter was taped to my door. Failure to comply will result in escalated legal action, it read, stamped with Miriam's signature as though her name alone was law. My fines had climbed to the thousands, enough that most people would have folded. They wanted me to sell, to move, to vanish. That was Miriam's endgame. Erase me, erase my family's claim, and polish her empire without any rough edges. But every time I held one of those letters, I thought about my wife's hand resting on mine as we watched the sunset from that dock, about my boy's grin when he caught his first fish, the line tangled but his pride unshaken. Miriam hadn't just torn down wood, she'd spit on decades of memory. That wasn't something money could replace, and it sure as hell wasn't something I'd let her bury under paperwork. Sam stopped by that evening, his quiet presence a reminder that not everyone had bought into Miriam's cult of perfection. He leaned against my railing, eyes flicking toward the lake like he was making sure nobody was watching, and said in a low voice, "They're planning to push you into foreclosure. Word is Miriam already has a buyer lined up for your place, some developer from the city." I clenched my jaw. The house my grandfather built, the land my father tended, the dam my family owned, all of it reduced to a chess piece in Miriam's little game of power. "They don't know," I said quietly, almost to myself. Sam's brow furrowed. "Don't know what?" I looked out toward the north woods where the dam slept in the shadows. "That their entire empire sits in the palm of my hand." For the first time since this war began, Sam smiled. Not a broad grin, but the kind of sharp smile that comes when you realize the balance of power isn't what everyone thinks it is. He didn't ask questions, didn't press. He just nodded once, firm and slow, like a man acknowledging an unspoken pact. That night, I returned to the dam again. The moonlight cut silver lines across the water, and the gates gleamed where I had scraped away decades of rust. I tested the crank, felt the steady resistance of the gears, and pictured what would happen if I opened it fully. The water would surge forward, rushing downriver with a roar. The lake would drop, exposing muddy banks where manicured lawns now sat. Docks, patios, and foundations would crack as the shoreline shifted. The houses Miriam had paraded as her crown jewels, $15 million worth of lakefront property, would sit like stranded ships in the muck. Their value would evaporate overnight. And Miriam? She'd be exposed. Her promises of wealth and prestige reduced, and to rubble by the very ground she'd built her empire on. I stood there for hours, listening to the hum of cicadas, the rush of wind through the trees, the quiet creak of the dam beneath my boots. Revenge has a sound, I realized. It isn't loud, it isn't immediate. It's the low, patient groan of iron under pressure, waiting for the right hand to release it. When I finally turned back toward home, the decision was made. The question wasn't if I would open the floodgates. The question was, when? The next few days were a strange performance, like living in two worlds at once. On the surface, I played the part Miriam wanted, the beaten-down old man, quietly mowing his lawn, collecting the mail, nodding politely when neighbors passed by. But underneath, every move I made was calculated. Every step was closer to the dam. I kept my work there hidden. Early mornings, before anyone stirred, I slipped into the woods. By now, the dam was more than functional. It was a weapon sharpened and waiting. I reinforced the crank housing, replaced a few corroded rods, even rigged a pulley system to make the gates easier to control. My grandfather built it with nothing but stubborn grit and a dream. I was upgrading it with purpose. What struck me most was how oblivious the others were. Miriam strutted through the neighborhood like a queen inspecting her kingdom. She stopped her SUV in front of my house twice, never getting out, just sitting there with her sunglasses glinting. A silent message: "I'm watching you." The second time, I stared right back until she drove off. She thought intimidation would break me. Instead, it only reminded me how close she was to losing everything. One evening, I sat on my porch with Sam, sipping coffee. He'd become my silent confidant in all this, though I never told him specifics. He didn't ask. He just sat there, letting the silence do the work. Finally, he muttered, "Funny thing about water. Folks think it's peaceful. Oh, but it only takes one shift, one break, and it'll swallow everything." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Meanwhile, Miriam continued her campaign of humiliation. A newsletter appeared in every mailbox boasting about the success of the HOA's leadership. She named me directly: non-compliant homeowner fined for endangering community standards. Neighbors whispered when I walked by. Some avoided my eyes, others smirked. The same people who once shared beers on my dock now treated me like an outcast. That was fine. Let them laugh. Let them drink their wine under string lights and toast Miriam for raising their property values. Soon enough, the lake would answer for me. The final push came on a Thursday night. Another certified letter arrived demanding immediate payment of fines, tens of thousands now, or face foreclosure proceedings. Miriam wasn't just trying to erase me. She was trying to take my land, my home, my history, and hand it over to someone with deeper pockets. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with the letter in front of me, the shoebox of photos beside it, my wife's smile, my son's small hands learning the ropes, the dock glowing under a summer sunset, the laughter, the life, the love. Miriam had called it a violation. I called it sacred. By dawn, the decision was no longer a question. I grabbed the toolbox, slung a lantern over my shoulder, and walked into the woods. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of wet earth, the kind of morning where the world feels like it's holding its breath. When I reached the dam, I ran my hand along the iron gate, felt the vibration of the water pressing against it, restless and eager. The gears gleamed faintly in the lantern light, oiled and ready. My fingers closed around the crank, steady, firm. I whispered, "This is for her. This is for all of us." And then, with a slow, deliberate whist, I began to open the floodgates. The sound was the first thing that hit me. A deep, resonant groan as the gears turned, followed by a hiss of rushing water pressing through the gap I'd carved open. At first it was only a trickle, a silver thread slipping into the riverbed below. But with every crank, the gap widened, and the trickle became a stream. The stream became a torrent. Soon, the dam roared like thunder, the floodgates vomiting decades of captive force. The water surged downriver, ripping through reeds and brush, carving new paths through forgotten channels. Behind the gates, the lake dropped inch by inch, then foot by foot. The shoreline retreated like a tide fleeing from shore. I stood there, lantern flickering, soaked with mist, and for the first time in years, I felt alive. This was no longer about a dock. This was about power. Raw, unstoppable power, and it was mine to wield. By the time the sun crept up, the lake was already unrecognizable. The pristine lawns that Miriam had flaunted in glossy newsletters were streaked with mud. Stone patios jutted awkwardly over empty ground. Expensive docks hung suspended above muck like broken teeth in a crooked smile. By mid-morning, the neighborhood buzzed with panic. I stayed on my porch, sipping coffee, watching the chaos unfold. Neighbors in golf shirts and tennis skirts stood along the shrinking shoreline, hands on hips, mouths hanging open. Boats tilted sideways in the mud, their hulls creaking. Kids cried while their parents barked into phones, demanding answers. And Miriam? She stormed around like a general whose army had deserted her. Sunglasses gone, hair frizzed from the humidity, her voice carried across the lake. This is sabotage. Someone has tampered with the dam. She said it like an accusation flung into the wind, desperate to pin the blame on someone, anyone, before the crowd realized the truth, that her empire was built on sand, and the sand had just been washed away. I leaned back in my chair, every muscle loose, and let the scene play out. Not once did anyone look in my direction. They were too busy wading into the mud, too consumed with the sight of their million-dollar investments collapsing into worthless shells. The sheriff's office was called. Trucks rumbled up. Men in uniforms spread out, muttering into radios, scanning the horizon. I knew most of them. Some had eaten dinner at my house, their kids diving off my dock while we grilled burgers. None of them looked toward me with suspicion. Why would they? I was the quiet old man, the one Miriam had painted as harmless, pitiful even. By noon, the shouting had dulled into a kind of stunned silence. The lake that once sparkled with mirrored reflections now resembled a giant scar. Muddy banks, skeletal docks, stranded boats. Miriam tried to rally, standing on a lawn chair to bark orders, but the spell was broken. Her followers weren't clapping anymore. They were glaring. Their wealth had evaporated overnight, and no amount of HOA newsletters or champagne galas could bring it back. Sam strolled over in the afternoon, calm as ever. He didn't say much, just stood beside me on the porch and watched the scene like we were observing wildlife. Finally, he muttered, "Looks like the lake finally remembered who it belongs to." I didn't answer. My eyes stayed on Miriam, watching her flail in the mud, her perfect empire crumbling around her. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. If the morning was chaos, the evening was war. Miriam wasn't the type to fold when the tide turned against her. She was the type to double down, claws out, teeth bared. By sundown, she had rallied what was left of her loyalists on the ruined shoreline, her voice hoarse but sharp as glass. This was deliberate sabotage, she declared, pacing in front of the crowd like a prosecuting attorney. Someone tampered with the dam, and I promise you, we will find them. We will not let one bitter old man destroy everything we've built here. The jab wasn't subtle. Heads turned in my direction. Some eyes were confused, others suspicious, a few openly hostile. But nobody moved toward me, not yet. Miriam had built her power on fear and image, but now both were slipping through her fingers, and she knew it. I stayed calm. I had nothing to hide on paper. The dam was still Harris property, no matter how much people assumed otherwise. Legally, it was mine to maintain, or in this case, release. Miriam could scream sabotage all she wanted, but the law wasn't as quick to bend to her will as her neighbors were. Still, I knew she wouldn't stop at shouting. She'd go to the sheriff. She'd call county inspectors. Hell, she might even drag me to court. But that was fine, because while Miriam fought to control the narrative, the lake itself was telling the truth in muddy, undeniable streaks across every ruined lawn. By nightfall, the neighborhood looked like a war zone. Stranded boats tilted in the muck like dead fish. Docks dangled uselessly, their pilings exposed. Million-dollar patios were cracked, split by the retreating shoreline. The glow of floodlights lit up frantic homeowners trying to salvage whatever they could. And through it all, Miriam stalked like a wounded queen, trying to reassert her throne. Sam came by again, his timing uncanny as ever. He handed me a beer without a word, and leaned on the railing beside me. Together, we watched Miriam shouting into her phone, pacing in frantic circles. "She's gonna come for you," Sam said finally. I sipped the beer, cold and bitter. "I'm counting on it." His brow furrowed. "You sure you're ready for that fight?" I didn't look at him. My eyes stayed fixed on the shoreline, on the frantic figures dragging furniture back from the muck. "Sam, she took my dock, my memories, my family's history. She thought she could bury me under fines and laughter. But the thing she never understood," I paused, the words tasting like iron, "is that water always finds a way." That night, sleep came easy for the first time in months. I lay in bed, the windows open, the scent of wet earth drifting in. From a distance came the sound of shouting, engines rumbling, the crackle of walkie-talkies. Miriam was scrambling to patch a dam she didn't own, control a lake that was never hers. And I just rested, because I knew the storm she had unleashed was only beginning. The next morning, a knock rattled my front door, hard, impatient. When I opened it, two deputies stood there, hats low, hands on their belts. Behind them, Miriam hovered like a hawk, sunglasses back on, lips curled into a venomous smile. "Mr. Harris," one deputy said, voice flat, "we need to talk about the dam." The deputies didn't wait for an invitation. They stepped past me into the living room, boots heavy against the wooden floor, radios crackling at their sides. Miriam followed like she owned the place, perfume thick enough to choke the air, sunglasses still perched on her face even though the sun wasn't fully up. She looked around my home as if cataloging everything she could use against me, that smug smile carved across her lips. "Mr. Harris?" the taller deputy said again, removing his hat but not softening his tone. "We've had reports that the gates at the North Dam have been tampered with. Water levels dropped significantly overnight. We need to ask you a few questions." Miriam cut in before I could speak, her voice sharp and theatrical. "Ask him? He owns the dam. He's the only one who could have done this. Do you know what's happened to our homes? Do you understand the damage? He's ruined millions of dollars in property value. Millions!" Her words were like a snake's hiss, venomous and loud enough for the neighbors gathering outside to hear. I glanced out the window. Sure enough, a small crowd had formed on the street. Men in polos, women clutching coffee mugs, kids clinging to their parents' legs, all of them staring at my house as if it were the den of a criminal. Miriam had orchestrated this perfectly. Humiliation, not just confrontation. I turned back to the deputies, calm as I could manage. "First off, the Harris family built that dam. My grandfather, to be exact. And the deed is still in our name. It's been that way for almost 100 years. If anyone has the legal right to open or close those gates, it's me." The shorter deputy shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting that answer. He glanced at Miriam, but she only stiffened, lips pressed thin before spitting out, "That dam is community property." "No," I cut her off, my voice firmer than I expected. "That dam is private property, my property, and I have the paperwork to prove it. Just because you assume the town owned it doesn't make it true." The taller deputy cleared his throat, eyes flicking between us. "Even if that's the case, Mr. Harris, the sudden drop in water levels has caused extensive damage. There may be liability issues. If it's determined that you knowingly release the water without proper notice to the county, you could be held responsible for the losses." Miriam's smug grin widened like a cat cornering a mouse. She stepped closer, pointing a manicured finger at me. "See? He admits it. He knows he did this, and now the law will handle it. You've destroyed our homes, Harris, and when this is over, you'll lose everything. Your land, your house, everything you've ever clung to." I stared at her, steady and unflinching. Her theatrics didn't scare me. What struck me instead was how desperate she sounded. She wasn't protecting the community. She was protecting herself, her reputation, her empire of inflated property values. "Deputies," I said, voice calm, "I'll be happy to provide you the deed records, maintenance notes, and any documentation you need. But let's be clear about one thing. What's happening out there isn't sabotage. It's nature. You build too close to the water, you gamble with the water line, and you lose. That's not on me. That's on the greed of this HOA and its president." Gasps rippled from the open doorway where neighbors strained to listen. Miriam's face flushed crimson beneath her carefully applied makeup. She lunged closer, jabbing her finger toward me. "You arrogant old man! You think this is about your little dock? You think you can humiliate me? You don't know who you're dealing with." The taller deputy raised a hand, cutting her off. "Ma'am, that's enough." His voice carried the weight of a man tired of being dragged into neighborhood squabbles. He turned back to me. "Mr. Harris, I suggest you bring your documentation down to the station today. Until we review it, we're advising you not to touch the dam again." I nodded slowly. "Fair enough." The deputy stepped back, satisfied enough for now. But Miriam didn't move. She lingered in my living room, breathing hard, fists clenched at her sides. For the first time, I saw the cracks in her armor. The sunglasses couldn't hide the fury burning in her eyes. She wanted me broken, begging, erased. Instead, I was standing tall in my own home, while her kingdom drowned in mud. Finally, she spat out, "This isn't over." Then she whirled around, storming out the door, her heels clacking like gunshots on the porch. The crowd outside parted as she strode past, whispering among themselves. Some still glared at me, but others looked uncertain, doubt creeping into their eyes. They'd followed Miriam blindly when things were good. Now that things were bad, they weren't so sure. I closed the door behind the deputies, the house quiet again. On the table sat Miriam's latest letter, fines stacked high like a tower of threats. I picked it up, stared at her signature at the bottom, and laughed for the first time in months. Because Miriam was right about one thing. This wasn't over. It was only the beginning. By the next morning, Miriam had launched her counterattack. I could tell before I even picked up the phone that she'd been busy, because 3 voicemails blinked on the machine, all from numbers I didn't recognize. Each one was a different lawyer, their tones clipped and official, asking me to make myself available for a preliminary discussion regarding community damages. Community damages. That was Miriam's way of dressing up. My empire is crumbling, and I need a scapegoat. But it wasn't just lawyers. County inspectors showed up by noon, wearing reflective vests and carrying clipboards, their trucks parked crooked along the road. They marched around the shoreline, measuring water levels, photographing cracked patios, taking notes while owners hovered nearby like vultures circling carrion. Miriam, of course, was right there with them, shadowing every step, gesturing with wild sweeps of her arms as if sheer volume could rewrite the facts. "This is devastation," she cried, her voice loud enough to carry across the lake. "Our community has suffered catastrophic losses. Property values, millions of dollars, vanished overnight. And the man responsible is sitting on his porch pretending nothing happened." And it was true. I was sitting on my porch, mug of coffee in hand, dog at my feet, calm as glass. When the inspectors glanced my way, I raised my mug in a polite half-wave. I saw the conflict in their eyes. They weren't here to take sides, but they weren't blind either. They saw Miriam's theatrics, her desperation. What Miriam didn't understand, and what gave me the steadiness she couldn't touch, was the paper trail. The Harris deed to the dam was ironclad. I'd pulled it out of the lockbox and laid it on the table, pages yellowed with age, but signed and sealed by the county itself. The dam was ours. It always had been. No resolution, no amendment, no HOA charter could erase that. But Miriam wasn't fighting in the realm of truth. She was fighting in the realm of perception. By sundown, she'd whipped up the HOA board into a frenzy. They went door to door with petitions, demanding emergency action against Harris. Some neighbors signed eagerly, desperate for someone to blame. Others hesitated, their loyalty fraying under the weight of doubt. Sam told me later that one couple slammed the door in Miriam's face after she called me a danger to the community. The cracks were spreading. That evening, as I sat on the porch, Sam wandered over again, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets. He leaned against the railing, quiet for a long while, just watching the sun sink over the half-drained lake. The water line was so low now that old stumps and rocks jutted out like bones from the earth. Expensive boats sat like stranded whales on the muck. "They're coming at you hard," he said finally. "They'll keep coming," I replied. "She can't afford to lose face. This isn't about the homes anymore. It's about her crown." Sam gave a low whistle. "Funny thing is, I've heard people talking. Not everyone's with her anymore. Some are saying maybe it wasn't such a good idea to build so close to the water, that the HOA pushed them into it. You let that rumor grow, Miriam might find herself fighting more than just you." That was the key. Miriam had power when everyone believed in her. But the second doubt took root. Her empire would rot from the inside. I looked out at the lake, a wasteland compared to its old glory, and felt no regret. Every drop that had slipped past the gates was a reminder that her grip wasn't as strong as she thought. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table with the old deed spread out in front of me, I made a decision. Miriam wanted a legal war? She'd get one, but she wouldn't be the only one writing letters. I dug out my own typewriter, the same one my wife used for Christmas cards, and began drafting a statement, not to Miriam, not to the HOA, but to the county itself, a reminder of ownership, of liability, of the risks they'd ignored when they let developers build mansions in the flood zone. By the time I rolled the last page from the carriage, I felt lighter. Miriam thought she could bury me under paper and signatures. She'd forgotten I had a pen of my own. The next morning, I mailed out every copy, one to the county clerk, one to the sheriff's office, one to the state water authority. Miriam wanted a fight in the daylight? Fine, I'd fight her there. But the shadows, the dam, the water, they were still mine. The county didn't waste time. Within 3 days, I had responses, official letters, stamped and signed. The kind Miriam liked to wave around like weapons, except this time, they weren't hers to brandish. The clerk acknowledged the horror. Riss family deed, noting it was valid and binding under county records. The sheriff's office simply stated, no violation of law has been found at this time, and the State Water Authority sent the most devastating blow of all. The Clearwater Dam is privately owned. Maintenance and operation decisions rest solely with the deed holder unless specific public safety concerns are identified. It was the equivalent of the state shrugging its shoulders and saying, he can do what he wants. I knew these letters would hit Miriam like stones hurled at stained glass, and right on cue, by that evening she was stomping down my gravel driveway in designer heels, sunglasses flashing, papers clutched like battle flags. You think you're clever, don't you? She snapped, slamming the letters onto my porch table, waving your dusty old deed around like it means something. Well, guess what? This community doesn't answer to you. They answer to me. I leaned back in my chair, calm, almost amused. Then why are you so rattled, Miriam? Her nostrils flared. She wasn't used to someone cutting straight through her armor. For a moment, the mask slipped, and I saw it, the fear. She was standing on a collapsing stage, and she knew it. You've cost us millions, she hissed. Homes ruined, values destroyed. Do you think the residents will forgive you? Do you think they'll forgive this? She gestured toward the lake, half drained and ugly, boats stranded like corpses. No, they'll come for you. I'll make sure of it. Her words might have carried weight a month ago, but now they sounded desperate. The neighbors had seen her fail. They'd seen her screaming at inspectors, badgering lawyers, and now storming up to my porch like a madwoman. And as fate would have it, several of them were watching from the street. I caught Sam's eye down by his mailbox. He gave me the smallest smirk. I picked up the sheriff's letter, tapped it against the table. Funny thing about the law, Miriam, it doesn't bend just because you want it to. And another funny thing? People talk. They're starting to remember who pushed those mansions up to the shoreline, who promised them the jewel of the county, who told them their investment was untouchable. Her face drained of color. She realized what I was doing, not just defending myself, but redirecting the fire onto her. You'll regret this, she said finally, her voice a low growl. I'll bury you in lawsuits. I shrugged. Good luck. You'll be standing in line behind half your neighborhood. She stormed off, heels grinding into the gravel. Over the next week, the cracks widened. Whispers spread like wildfire. Couples who had toasted Miriam at her parties now muttered about her arrogance. A few even confronted her in public, demanding to know why their property insurance wasn't covering the damages, why the HOA reserves had been drained on beautification projects instead of emergency planning. Miriam deflected, dodged, lashed out, but it only made things worse. The final nail came at the next HOA meeting. She tried to rally them, striding to the podium in her usual blazer and sunglasses combo. But the crowd wasn't the same adoring flock. They were angry, tired, afraid. When one man stood up and shouted, "You told us this was safe. You said we'd be protected," the room erupted, voices piled on, accusations flying. And me? I didn't even attend. I sat on my porch, sipping coffee, listening to the distant echoes of chaos drifting across the lake. By the time Sam came by later that night, his grin said it all. They turned on her, he reported, almost gleeful, tore her to shreds. Half the board's talking about removing her. She looked like she was about to crack. I nodded slowly, savoring the moment. Good. She does. Erviz, every second of it. But deep down, I knew Miriam wasn't finished. People like her didn't go quietly. She'd lash out harder, dig deeper, maybe even cross lines she'd never dared before. The floodgates had opened once already, and Miriam was about to learn that water wasn't the only force she couldn't control. By the time the 10th day rolled around, Clearwater Shores looked nothing like the glossy brochures Miriam once flaunted. What was once billed as the premier lakefront community had transformed into a scarred reminder of greed and arrogance. The lake sat half-drained, its shoreline exposed like a wound, muddy ridges cutting into what used to be manicured lawns. The smell of stagnant water hung heavy in the air, and the homeowners, once smug and untouchable, were now scrambling, patching, fighting with contractors, insurance adjusters, and each other. But Miriam? She was unraveling. Word spread quickly after the last HOA meeting. She'd been formally challenged, stripped of her presidency, and replaced by a reluctant but desperate treasurer who wanted no part of the sinking ship. The vote hadn't even been close. People who once clapped at her speeches now shouted her down, calling her a fraud, a liar, a thief. Someone had even demanded to see the books, and from what Sam heard, the numbers weren't pretty. Money was gone, projects half-funded, reserves drained. She tried to spin it, of course, blamed me, blamed the county, blamed the weather, but the harder she screamed, the less anyone cared. Her empire of control had been built on fear and polish, and with the polish gone, all that was left was a bitter woman waving papers no one wanted to see. The night it all came crashing down, I was on my porch again, coffee in hand, listening to the crickets and the faint sound of shouting across the lake. Miriam had shown up at another neighbor's house, banging on their door, demanding they sign some petition to oust the saboteur. The neighbors told her to leave. When she wouldn't, they called the sheriff. And this time she didn't come back with deputies at her side. She left in the back of a cruiser, still shouting about her rights, about her authority, about how she was going to rebuild. But the words were empty. Everyone knew it. Sam came over a little later, shaking his head. She's finished. They're suing her for mismanagement, maybe even fraud. She's moving out. Saw the realtor sign go up this morning. I didn't answer right away. I just looked out at the broken shoreline, the mud, the abandoned boats. My dock was gone, but so was her throne. You going to rebuild? Sam asked after a while. I smiled faintly. Maybe. Not the way it was, though. I don't need fancy boards or HOA approval, just a place to sit, a place that's mine. He nodded, and for the first time in months, the silence felt peaceful instead of heavy. That weekend, I walked down to the water with a small bundle of lumber, nothing fancy, just enough for a bench at the edge of the lake. Hammer in hand, I built it slowly, deliberately, the way my grandfather taught me. When it was done, I sat there, feet dangling in the mud, and looked out over the water. The lake wasn't beautiful anymore. It wasn't perfect, but it was free. Miriam thought she could erase me, humiliate me, grind my life into dust. Instead, she destroyed herself. Because you can demolish wood, you can scatter planks, you can even drain a lake, but you can't erase roots. And mine ran deeper than she ever understood.